What is Pleinairpril? Pleinairpril is a month-long art challenge held every year during the month of April, beginning in 2017. It was created by warrior painters originally to celebrate Earth Day. This challenge encourages artists to use the plein air method, which means in the open air or drawing outdoors. But studies from photos are also allowed, which is what I did. Now while I didn't really come close to finishing the challenge, only finishing 10 out of 30 possible drawings, I did manage to finish more than I did in the previous 2 years combined, and ended up with a few pieces that I'm quite happy with. So in this video I'm going to go through my drawings and later talk about the things that I did that I felt improved my speed and confidence in drawing background art. To start off with, I made a rectangle using the rectangle tool in the exact size of the reference image and placed it beside the reference on the canvas. This makes it easier to draw the general proportions of the image. Next I drew the outline of the clouds and then started coloring them in with hard edges. I then used the smudge brush tool to smoothen the edges. I color pick for most of my studies, but you can choose not to in order to help improve your ability to see colors clearly. I then drew a flower pot, then duplicated it to make the rest, and made some changes to each of the pots to make them look different. After which I added shadows to match the reference. To make the railing, I used the shift trick. The shift trick is where you hold shift, then make a dot where you want the line to begin, then make another dot where you want the line to end, and that creates a straight line in whatever direction you want. After this, I drew in the lamppost and then sized up the image and added noise. To make the noise effect, I made a new layer, filled it with grey, used the noise effect, then turned on overlay mode. Then I adjusted the opacity until I found something I liked. And here's the outcome. For this piece, I started off by painting in the water, then roughly drawing in the rocks, after which I drew the stairs as well as the other part of the lighthouse. I then started adding in the details, which I just tried to copy from the reference without much of a plan since I don't really have much practice with painting rocks. They ended up turning out okay, but I felt it could have been a lot better. I then used the lasso tool to draw the lighthouse as well as add the shadows. For this shadow, I used a hard brush at first, then blended it a bit before adding a soft brush to give it this gradient effect. I then drew the lantern room and using the lasso tool cut out the windows, then added the remaining details. To give the drawing some atmospheric perspective like in the reference, I color picked the sky and using a soft brush colored the edge of the water, giving it depth just like in the reference. And here's the result. For this piece, I started out with drawing the sand. For the details, I added some pinkish lines, some white lines, as well as some grey color near the water. For the cart, I used the lasso tool to get the shape, and then just painted what I saw. For the tire, I used the shape tool to get the right shape. Then with my brush and smoothing turned to 100, I drew the tire. For the bag, I drew the green bag on one layer, then on another layer I drew the contents. I'm not really sure what it is, so I just tried to copy it the best I could. I put the green bag layer above the layer with the content, then added a mask to the layer. On the mask layer, I used a black color soft brush to make the item visible. Masking is a good way of erasing something without actually erasing it, since you can just bring it back with a white color brush, or partially bring it back with a grey brush. I then drew the umbrella, and then drew the man, who I probably made a bit too wide. For the waves, I kind of just tried to draw them as I saw them, just drawing the big shapes without zooming in too much. And here's the result. This one was probably the simplest one. I first drew in the water, then just used a bunch of small lines to draw the reflections and waves in the water. I used the soft brush to make a gradient in the sky, and then drew in a boat. I painted in the clouds, smudged them, and added some finishing touches. And here's the result. I started out with a gradient for the sky, then drew the ground and shadow on the building. The building was relatively simple, since the shapes were pretty clear, which made it easy to understand and draw. The thing that I had an issue with was the foliage. Luckily I found this bristle brush which helped me get the texture I wanted. I'm not sure which brush pack I got it from, but I think any regular bristle brush will do. For the clouds, I used a brush called Storm Clouds and That Smoke from Quiz's brush pack, which you can get on his Patreon for free. I then drew in the moon, and here's the result. This was one of the two drawings where I made a small separate sketch before starting the painting. I sketched out the lotus leaf and then started painting. For this one I really had no plan, just painting what I see, painting the big shapes then adding in the details. For the finishing touch, I duplicated all the layers, then merged them. I then added Gaussian blur. I then created a mask layer and masked out the part I wanted to be the focal point. Then I added linear dodge for the light and noise to finish it off. And here's the result. This painting was also reposted on the Warrior Painters Instagram, so thank you Warrior Painters for reposting my drawing. At this point I kind of figured out a workflow, which is painting in the big shapes and then adding in the details, smudging out certain areas which need to look soft, adding linear dodge, then duplicating the layers, merging them using Gaussian blur, and then masking out the focal point, and then lastly adding noise. And here's the result. This drawing ended up being my first YouTube short which hit 1,000 views, which is pretty cool. This was another drawing where I sketched a bit before painting. The reference was very squarish and had a lot of hard edges, which made it easier to understand and draw, though it did take a while since there was a lot to do. I ended up getting stuck drawing the texture on the door. I tried a few different brushes, but in the end I just used the default round brush. I added some strong noise for the road texture and linear dodge for the light. And here's the result. This reference had a lot of atmospheric perspective, which made it look really cool. Overall, the drawing was relatively simple since there weren't many details apart from the ripples in the water. I just made sure to use a soft round brush to give the plants and some of the cranes some of that fogginess. The only thing that gave me some problems was the ripples in the water. I don't really like how it ended up looking, but it was the best I could do at the time, and I didn't want to end up wasting a bunch of time on it. And here's the result. The final piece. For this one, I used a new brush from Pyongyang Park's brush pack for rendering the rocks, and I think it ended up looking quite nice. For the wings on the bird, I used the lasso tool and a soft brush to get this cool gradient effect. I think a lot of anime illustrators do this for their characters. I'm quite happy with how this ended up looking. I think the seagull especially looks quite nice. Here's the result. So yeah, that's it. Now here are some things that I focused on during this challenge that I felt helped me improve my drawing process. This is something other people talk about a lot, and something I have struggled with and still struggle with, but I feel I did a much better job of avoiding it during this challenge. Since I started digital art, I've always had this habit of zooming in and trying to make sure every small detail was in place. Even if it was a small piece which you cannot see unless you zoom in a bunch, I would still try to correct it. Honestly, that stuff doesn't really matter, it just ends up wasting a bunch of time. At the end of the day, no one else is going to zoom in as much as I did. So long as the overall silhouette reads well, it's good. A good example of this was my 6th drawing. Before I blurred it, it was quite rough, and in previous years I would probably spent some time trying to fix it, even though I knew I was going to blur it. Shape language matters a lot, because if your shapes don't read well, your drawing will look off. I recommend learning about shape language if you haven't done so already, as it's really important in all forms of art. Marco Bucci and Sinux have some good videos on this topic, but for background specifically, I think this video by Mikhail Schwartruk is quite helpful, since his art style is similar to a lot of digital plein airs that I've seen. I'm normally a guy who over sketches a lot. I tend to try and sketch out every detail so that I don't have to think too much about where to paint, since I'm much more comfortable sketching than painting. Sometime last year after plein air was over, I decided to draw a background, but this time without sketching, and it turned out much better than I thought it would, and it was also much faster than any other background I had done so far. So I guess the lesson is sometimes it's better to just go for it. The oversketching was just me hesitating from doing the painting since I was not confident in my ability to paint. This is the issue I have, where if I don't like how a piece looks early on, I just delete it and start over. This isn't necessarily bad, especially if it's for an important assignment or a project. But if it's for a study or a challenge like this, you just end up wasting a bunch of time and not wanting to attempt the challenge. Plus, at the end of the day, this is a challenge for fun, so the end result isn't really that important. So for stuff like this, you might as well just finish it off and then decide whether you like it or not. Who knows, you might end up liking it. And if you don't, you can always delete it, but just not show anyone. And yeah, that's it for Pleinairpril 2026. This year was a pretty good year for me. I ended up with quite a few nice drawings, improved my rendering speed, and I've definitely developed more confidence when it comes to drawing backgrounds. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, maybe you found something useful from it, and if you took part in Pleinairpril, I hope you had a good time and ended up with a bunch of cool drawings. Thank you for watching.